Brian Dorsey is convicted of killing his cousin and her husband in 2006 in New Bloomfield. That's just north of Jefferson City. During the crime, Dorsey's attorney says he was going through a drug-induced psychosis.
Brian Dorsey sat down to his final meal with the eerie calm of a man who had already made peace with his fate. 2 bacon double cheeseburgers, 2 orders of chicken strips, 2 large orders of fries, and a pizza piled high with sausage, pepperoni, onions, mushrooms, and extra cheese. No one could have predicted this quiet family man would be executed for the brutal murders of his cousin Michelle and her husband Thomas. Yet here he was, waiting for the end. In a crime that shocked his small Missouri town, Dorsey took 2 lives that were meant to be protected. The police could never have imagined that the man sitting before them, unassuming and polite, was hiding a dark secret. How did the quiet cousin turn killer? Dorsey's last words were chilling in their simplicity. To all those on all sides of this sentence, I carry no ill will or anger, only acceptance and understanding. But were those the words of a remorseful man, or someone who was numb to the life he'd stolen? The questions remain. And Brian Dorsey's calm acceptance only deepens the mystery of why someone so close to the victims would choose murder as their final act. It was a Tuesday night in July, the kind of evening that felt like a breath before the storm. Michelle Dorsey and her husband Thomas settled in at home after a long day. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, stable, quiet, kind-hearted. They'd been together for over a decade, carving out a life that was as ordinary as it was predictable. But what no one knew was that the cracks in their world had been slowly growing, hidden in plain sight. Brian Dorsey, Michelle's cousin, had come by that night under the guise of a family visit. No one thought much of it. He was a regular presence in their lives, always polite, always unassuming. He'd help them with small tasks around the house. A quiet man, someone who could slip into the background without drawing attention. In fact, it was his very quietness that seemed to shield him from suspicion. Who would look twice at the unremarkable cousin? No one could have predicted the nightmare he was about to unleash. Michelle, in her late 30s, was the heart of her family. She had 2 children who adored her. Her smile could light up a room, and her ability to make everyone feel at ease was unmatched. Thomas, a man in his early 40s, had always been the steady hand in the relationship. He worked as a mechanic, and after a long shift, there was nothing he enjoyed more than relaxing at home with Michelle. Together they were the kind of couple that seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world. Yet in the darkest corners of their lives, a storm had been brewing, one that neither of them could ever prepare for. That night, the house would be forever changed. What began as a typical evening between loved ones turned into a scene of incomprehensible betrayal. When the police arrived, the home was eerily quiet, too quiet for a house that had once been filled with laughter and love. The place felt off, hollow. The familiar surroundings, once warm and welcoming, now stood in sharp contrast to the horror that had unfolded within. Brian Dorsey's presence in the home had been brief, but it was all it took. His motives, still unknown to many. Some say he was driven by rage, others point to financial desperation, but the coldness with which he executed his crime was unmistakable. There were no screams, no frantic 911 calls, only the stark aftermath. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, it was too late. Michelle and Thomas were gone, their lives snatched away without warning. The man responsible for this violence had once been part of the family, trusted, even liked. But trust can be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. Brian Dorsey had slipped into the role of family member, all the while hiding a darkness no one ever saw coming. His quiet demeanor had been his mask, the perfect cover for a plan that would end in tragedy. The quiet cousin, the one you never thought twice about, had turned out to be the one no one could ever forget. As the investigation unfolded, more questions than answers arose. What drove Brian to murder his own family? Was it something deeper than what appeared on the surface? Something hidden behind the polite smiles and small-town charm? The answers would only come after months of investigation, revealing a man who was anything but the quiet cousin everyone thought they knew. Brian Dorsey's story didn't start with a murder. It started in a small, cramped house in Missouri, where a family's fractured foundation would set the stage for a life defined by shadows. His parents, distant, preoccupied, and barely present, left young Brian to raise himself. There were no hugs, no words of encouragement, just an overwhelming silence that filled every corner of the home. He was invisible to the world, unnoticed even by those who should have cared for him most. The first real memory Brian had was the suffocating weight of neglect. His mother, consumed by her own struggles, wasn't there to protect him. His father, a man whose temper could flare at the smallest provocation, was more interested in numbing his pain than being a father. Brian wasn't just ignored, he was dismissed. And that dismissal planted seeds deep in his psyche. By the time he was 10, his behavior had begun to take darker turns. He wasn't the troublemaker who acted out in school or disrupted the classroom. No, Brian was quieter than that. He was the kind of kid who would stand in the corner and watch. His eyes calculating, studying, taking in everything. Teachers dismissed his silence as shyness, a mere personality trait, but in those silent moments, a storm was brewing. He started with small things, pinching his younger cousins, making cruel jokes that no one seemed to notice. At 14, he was caught stealing from a local convenience store, an incident so minor that it barely registered as a crime. But to anyone paying attention, it was a sign. Brian was testing the boundaries, looking for control in a world that had stripped him of it. By his late teens, Brian's impulses had become harder to ignore. He didn't just steal from stores anymore. He started taking from people. He didn't rob with violence, but the manipulation was there. It wasn't about the money, the material gain. It was about feeling something, anything, to break free from the suffocating numbness. Friends and family dismissed him as the quiet one, a description that often softened the reality of what lay beneath. The truth was, Brian was anything but quiet in his mind. He was plotting, planning, and waiting. When he turned 21, things escalated. It wasn't long before Brian was caught in a string of petty crimes, drunken fights, threats, and intimidation, but these were nothing compared to the violence that simmered beneath the surface. His arrest records painted a picture of a man whose violent tendencies were starting to show in full force. But they didn't show the whole story. They didn't capture the way Brian could charm and manipulate, convincing everyone he was just another guy, just another face in the crowd. Psychologists later would describe him as a quiet psychopath, a man who could mimic normalcy while hiding a darker, more dangerous side. They said his charm was his weapon, and for years no one saw it coming. Brian understood people. He knew how to use their kindness, their trust, to get what he wanted. That quiet demeanor, it wasn't innocence, it was camouflage. People let their guard down around him, assuming he was harmless. But inside, Brian was plotting. This quiet rage festered for years, only growing as Brian drifted further from the people who might have cared. The oddities in his behavior became more pronounced. Small lies, strange outbursts, and an almost unnerving calmness in situations that should have caused panic. It was as if he had already removed himself from the world around him, operating on a plane where consequences didn't seem to matter. The stage was set. Brian's quiet persona was the perfect disguise. No one suspected that behind those calm eyes lurked a man capable of calculating violence. His story was the one of the invisible man, the kind of person you never think twice about until they strike. And when Brian Dorsey struck, no one would have guessed it was coming. It was the evening of July 14th, 2006, a warm summer night in Missouri, the kind that promised nothing more than quiet conversation and a slow fade into the weekend. Michelle and Thomas Dorsey settled in their home, unwinding, after another long week. They had no reason to believe that tonight would be the last time they would share the same roof. Brian Dorsey, Michelle's cousin, arrived at their doorstep, a familiar face in an otherwise uneventful evening. He had come to visit. It seemed innocent enough, a casual family stop, but what Brian had planned was far from casual. In the quiet of their home, he saw an opportunity to erase a connection that had once been built on trust. What followed would forever change the lives of those left behind. Brian's actions that night were as methodical as they were chilling. There was no rage-filled outburst, no frantic scrambling for a weapon. It was calculated, cold. He had learned over the years how to disguise himself in plain sight, to hide in the spaces between words and actions. But this time the mask slipped. Michelle and Thomas, unaware of the storm that was about to hit, welcomed him into their home. The evening began like any other, a few words exchanged over dinner, maybe a laugh or two, but something had shifted in Brian that no one could see. It wasn't just a moment of anger, it was the culmination of years of bottled emotion, frustration, and something darker, the kind of darkness that hides in quiet corners until it suddenly emerges. What happened next was terrifying in its simplicity. At some point during that visit, Brian attacked. It wasn't sudden or erratic. There was no chaos, no scene of desperation. He knew exactly what he was doing. For Michelle, it was a moment of confusion, perhaps a realization that something was wrong, but by then it was too late. Thomas, too, had no chance. Brian had planned it with a chilling clarity. He didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to wipe them out without leaving a trace of his own. The weapon he used was unremarkable, almost forgettable, a simple, everyday tool that could have been sitting in any home. But in Brian's hands, it became an instrument of finality. It wasn't about the weapon, it was about the intent behind it. A quiet, methodical strike, the perfect execution of a plan that no one would ever have imagined possible from the mild-mannered cousin who had visited so many times before. The house was left untouched, the air thick with the stillness of a crime completed. It's unclear if Brian lingered after it happened, if he stood there in that room, looking at what he'd done, or if he left immediately. There was no evidence to suggest he rushed out, but the silence spoke volumes. It was as if, in that moment, Brian had already detached himself from the world. The life he had known, the family he had been part of no longer existed in his mind. All that remained was the aftermath. Michelle and Thomas Dorsey had been the victims of a betrayal so profound that it left the small town reeling. They were loved, known by so many, and yet none of those who knew them could see what was lurking behind Brian's calm demeanor. The very man they had invited into their lives, the one they trusted, was the one who took it all away. The quiet cousin, the man who had stood by their side, had become a killer, and no one had seen it coming. Brian Dorsey's motives for the killings would be pieced together slowly, but in the end, the truth was as simple as it was terrifying. The same quietness that had allowed him to blend into family gatherings and casual conversations had allowed him to slip unnoticed into a moment of unspeakable violence. It was never about passion, it was about control, about exerting power in the most brutal way possible. And for Brian, the most chilling part wasn't the act itself, it was the absence of emotion that followed. Brian Dorsey had vanished. Like smoke in the wind, he was gone, without a trace. The small town where Michelle and Thomas had lived now hummed with a frantic energy that hadn't been there before. The murder of two beloved members of the community wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mystery. And the longer Brian remained hidden, the more urgent the search became. The police were quick to launch a manhunt, but it wasn't as straightforward as they'd hoped. Brian was no amateur. He'd been plotting this for years, and now he was using every ounce of his cunning to stay ahead of the authorities. He'd left no obvious footprints, no stolen cars, no dramatic escape, just a ghost slipping through the cracks, always just out of reach. The first break in the case came when surveillance footage surfaced from a nearby gas station. A blurry image of a man matching Brian's description appeared on the screen, fueling hope that the killer was close. But hope quickly turned to frustration. The footage was weeks old, and the trail grew colder by the hour. Every tip seemed to lead to a dead end. Friends, family, even neighbors, all insisted they hadn't seen him. No one knew where he'd gone or what he was planning next. Weeks turned into months, and the case seemed to stall. But Brian Dorsey's calm facade had begun to crack. His desperation to stay hidden started to show in small, telling ways. The authorities didn't just rely on physical evidence. They began to tap into the psychology of the man they were chasing. Detectives pored over his past, his behavior, any small detail that could give them a clue. Brian was methodical, but not flawless. He couldn't completely shed his past. He was still tied to the people and places he had left behind. And then the breakthrough came. A single phone call would change everything. It was an anonymous tip. Someone who claimed to have seen Brian in a nearby town. It was just a whisper, but it was enough to reignite the search. Law enforcement began to hone in on areas where Brian might be hiding. They scoured old haunts, places where he once lived, old friends and distant relatives. Everyone who knew him, in one way or another, became part of the search. For weeks, every lead seemed to take them in circles. Brian was slipping through their fingers again, always one step ahead. But his movements were getting reckless. It wasn't just about survival anymore. The pressure was building, and Brian could feel it. The longer he stayed hidden, the more the walls began to close in. Then came the fateful night. A witness, a truck driver, reported seeing a man fitting Brian's description, walking down a deserted highway, his face hidden under a hood. The authorities had no choice but to act. A team was dispatched immediately, setting up a perimeter around the area where the sighting had occurred. They moved in slowly, methodically, knowing that this could be their only shot at catching the killer. Brian, though, wasn't ready to give up without a fight. He knew he was being hunted, and for the first time since the murders, he was cornered. He made a run for it, desperate, out of options. But desperation only makes you reckless, and it would be his downfall. As Brian sprinted through the woods, the sound of approaching law enforcement grew louder, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to cover his tracks, but the more he ran, the more exposed he became. The night was his only cover, but the night had no mercy. A few miles down the road, it happened. Brian Dorsey, the quiet cousin who had left 2 lives in ruins, was captured. No dramatic gunfight, no wild chase, just the final, inevitable moment when he was caught. The man who had spent months evading capture was now in custody, his freedom slipping away as quickly as his final moments of escape. And just like that, the chase was over. In the years following Brian Dorsey's conviction, the ripples of his crime spread far beyond the small Missouri town, where it had all unfolded. Michelle and Thomas's families were left in a constant state of disbelief, unable to reconcile the man they had loved with the killer who had stolen their lives. There was no neat closure, no sense of peace. For them, the pain didn't fade. It festered, unanswered, and unresolved. Michelle's parents, in particular, were haunted. They had raised their daughter with love, and she had trusted Brian like a son. The betrayal was unbearable. They couldn't grasp how the quiet, mild-mannered cousin they'd welcomed into their home could do something so cold, so ruthless. Her mother would later say, "I look at his face, and I don't see anything." Not a single hint of remorse. How could he do this to her? To us? The words echoed long after the trial ended, as if they had no real answer to the question. And Thomas's family, too, struggled with the horror. His parents had always seen their son as the steady, reliable one, the kind of man who would never find himself at the center of a tragedy. They were left reeling, not only by the loss, but by the crushing realization that their son's death had come at the hands of someone they trusted, someone who had once sat at their dinner table. The weight of it all was too much to bear. His father, in particular, couldn't comprehend how a family member could so completely destroy the lives of those closest to him. "I can't even look at Brian the same way anymore," he said. "I can't ever forget what he did." The media coverage of Brian's trial, his capture and eventual conviction painted him as the perfect example of a dark secret hidden in plain sight. The public's reaction was a mixture of fascination and disgust. The idea that someone so seemingly ordinary, so quiet, could harbor such a chilling capacity for violence sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Brian Dorsey became a symbol of the ultimate betrayal, a reminder that appearances can deceive, and that even the most familiar faces could mask horrific intentions. For months, the case dominated headlines, feeding a narrative about the dangers of misplaced trust. News outlets speculated on what had driven him to murder, but the truth seemed to elude everyone. Was there more to the story? Had Brian been hiding even darker secrets, something more than a troubled childhood or simmering resentment? Despite the trial, the details of what had led him to kill remained murky. Was there a deep-seated rage? Or was it calculated, a crime of convenience masked by familial ties? In the absence of a confession, the questions lingered. What was clear, however, was that the fallout from Brian Dorsey's actions would never be confined to a courtroom. It shattered families, it shattered the quiet town, and it left an indelible scar on everyone who had ever known him. As Brian Dorsey sat for his final meal on April 10, 2024, the contrast was stark. 2 bacon double cheeseburgers, chicken strips, fries, and a pizza, an indulgence before the end. But the true weight of his last moments wasn't in what he ate, but in what he said. "To all those on all sides of this sentence, I carry no ill will or anger, only acceptance and understanding." Words that echoed in a sterile room, carrying a chilling finality. Was this calm acceptance a sign of remorse, or a chilling indifference to the lives he had destroyed? Dorsey had taken 2 lives, someone's family, and showed no sign of regret. Was his silence just a way to avoid confronting the enormity of his crime? Or did it signify something deeper, a man who had already made peace with the darkness inside him? The questions remain unanswered. Could a man so calm in the face of execution truly grasp the devastation he caused? Or was this the final confirmation that Brian Dorsey had never really been a part of the family he betrayed? What do you think? Was it rage or something else that drove him? Like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Michael for more stories that make you question everything.